Okay, I'd like to just start with a land acknowledgement. I'd like to acknowledge that we are in the Mi'kma'ki land, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people here in Nova Scotia. So I'm grateful to be on this land and continue to learn more about its history, which unfortunately was hidden from us for many years and unknown to us. So this is my last slide that I'd like to start with in case we run out of time, because I think it's the most important for any young scholars in the room. I know that there are some master's students and doctoral students in the room. So here are some resources. So for knowledge translation, I'm affiliated with the child, well, I guess I'm on the board of directors for the Child and Family Blog. It's a remarkable nonprofit organization. So I just want to encourage you, if you're interested in translating your research and getting that science out to families and parents, consider checking out this blog. It's the #1 parenting blog on Google apparently this week. So what you can do is you can write about your most recent publication and have it translated, or you would translate it into something that is accessible to families, policymakers, and parents. Okay, so a great way to get your research out. Another great resource, if you're interested, I think it might be the right audience for that, is community engaged research. This book called Bridging Knowledge Cultures, which has a free download by Dr. Bud Hall. And that's about recognizing science as not existing just within the academy, but also in the knowledge of parents and families and community members. And so he has some great recommendations and tips in that book with his colleague, his co-author. Also, Methods and Considerations. So that's a book that I've contributed to a couple of chapters, and it's edited by Shana Lulevy and Stephen Asatsa. It's Methods and Considerations for Cross-Cultural Developmental Research, Theoretical, Methodological, Practical, and Ethical Considerations for an Interdisciplinary Field. So if you're interested in doing child development research on childhood learning, then that might be a great resource for you. Okay, so my talk outline today, I am going to tell you a bit about the motivation in my work and why I'm here and what motivates me, what gets me out of bed each morning, and then talk a little bit about our field research methods. So what we do and how we do it. Is there a question? Oops. Okay, I heard a noise, and as well as core similarities and cultural influences. So some of the findings that seem to sort of exist and cut through cross-cultural boundaries, as well as the interesting variability that exists. So the motivation, part one, I completed my Bachelor of Science at a university in Nova Scotia, St. Francis Xavier University, with a major in psychology and a minor in environmental science. And at the time, I decided to continue on in environmental science, and I did an internship in rural Kenya. And the focus of this internship was to learn about sustainable agriculture practices and to work with families and communities there. And on the side, I did a bit of developmental psych work or research with some former mentors. And what I discovered was that the textbook that I had been learning about for 4 years in my undergraduate degree didn't appear to match what my observations were. So there seemed to be sort of missing a missing piece in the developmental psychology textbooks that I became curious about. So in this little study, which I wouldn't recommend using these methods again, I was unskilled at the time, but I did do mirror self-recognition, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, but it's really just a test to determine whether children will recognize their image in a mirror, children and other species. Anyhow, I won't go on about mirror self-recognition, but I want to highlight this, is that if you look at the figure here, you notice that in Canada and the US, the two tall blue bars in this graph, the children removed the mark right away when they demonstrated a pass. And they're either approaching 80% or above 80% by a certain age. The details don't matter at this point, but what you will notice is that in the other societies, it's less than 40% for removing the mark, which is the classic pass, okay, the blue bars. And this is really a problem. So this got me really curious. How is this even possible? Is it a not so interesting methodological problem, which is not so interesting, but still a major problem? Because if we're testing other species with the same test, then it turns out that it might not be a good test in general. Or is there some interesting variability across cultures? Do we all start out, thinking of the self in the same way, and then we diverge? Lots of questions came to mind after this. So that's the beginning. What I did discover was that Western developmental science appeared to be child-focused. It emphasized one-on-one interactions, okay? And our research reflects this. I'm sure you're all well aware. Children are guided. Parenting is synonymous with teaching, right? You parent your child, you teach them, you guide them. The responsibility rests with caregivers, not the child. Early experience in man-made and often urban environments. And development happens in invariant sequence and timing is specific. For example, motor development, theory of mind, mirror self-recognition, any of these classic tests, as well as many others, it's discussed and reported and believed to happen in invariant sequence with very precise and specific timing. This didn't match with my observations living in other places around the globe, as well as my readings of ethnographies, for example. So when I discovered anthropology and discovered ethnographies, I noticed a very different story that seemed to match with my observations in the field. And that was in the field as well as my own upbringing and observing parents here in rural Nova Scotia. So I just put up an image of David Lancy because he's been a pioneer in the field of writing about children. So writing about the anthropology of childhood and emphasizing that face-to-face interactions in early childhood are rare, and in some cases, I won't say non-existent, but quite rare. And according to ethnographies, they're largely unobserved. So this talking to your baby and playing with your baby in the ways that we say are essential and healthy are not observed in some societies. So how is that even possible? Child-directed and infant-directed speech were thought to be rare, if non-existent. I'm sure some of you may be familiar with the work of Alex Christia and colleagues that find that infant-directed speech is in fact extremely rare in some societies beyond the Western urban cultures. And alloparenting, so that is multiple caregiving, seems to be prominent. It seems that are many societies where children are cared for by multiple individuals. So not this, children don't have one primary caregiver responsible for them or two primary caregivers responsible for them. And this comes from work by Bob Levine, where he argues that the focus of caregiving is pediatric in other societies, not a pedagogical model. So that we're focused on the health and well-being of children and not the teaching or scaffolding. So as you can see, the textbooks really reflect a scaffolding or a pedagogical model in an urban, as you said, Eurocentric way. The responsibility for teaching rests on the child and not the teacher, okay, not the parent. And so in some of their work, they argue that there is no teaching, no explicit forms of teaching that happen in these societies. So, okay, so then there's a conflict between these different truths. All right, so there's a missing piece. So I was really curious about this missing piece, the representation of other societies in the literature, the sampling problem, generalizability, as well as the methodological approach. Okay, so I wanted to kind of draw your attention to others who also have stated this rather explicitly. And this is a great paper by Auden Dahl that came out in 2017 that argues that assumptions and bias in psychological research rest on unstated and untested assumptions. So that most of our work, we write about children and infants doing X, doing Y, caregivers doing X, doing Y, without stating what specific population or what assumptions we're actually making about that population. So what are these unstated assumptions and which ones are untested? So an assumption that our research findings represent what is happening in the everyday lives of children and families. So that is the assumption in our literature, that we are talking about families and children and what we find in a laboratory setting or with our interviews and our questionnaires or even our structured observations, that is a snapshot of what is happening in the everyday lives of people. And we don't know that. So someone has to do that work and to look and see whether or not there is a match with some of these assumptions. And Auden Dahl argues for natural observations. Rather than trying to increase the validity of our tests, let's look at let's use natural observations to determine whether what we are finding is in fact representative of the real context. Okay, so we're still in the motivation part, so I'll sum this up in the next couple of slides, but just comment on generalizability. So as you may all be familiar with a paper by a former mentor of mine who is in anthropology at the moment, when he was mentoring me, and that's Joseph Henrich. In 2010, Henrich and colleagues came out with this paper that I really liked because, and of course there are some problems now with the acronym, of course, but I won't go into that, but anyway, what Henrich did, what I really liked about this paper is that he summarized the social science literature. He examined the cases when there were cross-cultural comparisons, okay, or cross-country comparisons. And when there were cross-country comparisons in certain psychological or other social science domains, he looked to see how our urban and Western folks, Western educated, industrialized, rich and democratic, these weird societies, how are they faring? And what he found is that we are outliers, okay? So if we are outliers on all of these domains, that suggests that our research might not be generalizable, right? We might be studying ourselves for ourselves. So the main points of the article were that these generalizability and implicit assumptions are capturing an extremely narrow slice of human diversity. So these important domains have assumed to have psychological universals, and it might not be the case. Of course, there could be other explanations, but we don't know whether or not there are psychological universals with some of these cases. There's one section on developmental psychology, which I encourage you all to take a look at. Following that, in 2017, a paper came out by Mark Nielsen and colleagues, also an excellent paper. And just to kind of summarize, they're looking at representation. Who are the people? So not whether or not we are outliers, but when we look at all of the studies, so not just cross-cultural literature, when we look at developmental psych in the top developmental psych journals, who are we sampling? Okay. And if you look here at the blue arrow, I'm pointing to about 90%. So that makes up the US is in the blue, English-speaking participants in the green, and European participants in the yellow. So that comprises 90% of the literature. So that's the participant representation. It turns out there's a sampling bias toward US, English-speaking, and European participants. So additionally, they looked at who is producing the research, and they found a similar finding. Okay, so there seems to be, hopefully I've convinced you there is a problem. With my colleague Michelle Klein and Rubina Shamsuddin, we argued that this is unscientific and unethical. It's unscientific because it begs to question the accuracy of our science by focusing just on a small, narrow population of the world, as well as unethical because of the representation problem, right? Where's the rest of the population that we're not sampling? Okay, so, and just another point here, I wanted to highlight this because there seems to be a push, at least at my university, at Simon Fraser University, to decolonize psychology and to decolonize formalized education. Now, some people would argue that that's almost impossible task, but I think that there are ways that we can make good progress if we put our minds to it. This is an excellent paper by Heidi Keller and colleagues and Seth Opong, who had recently passed away, but who was an African scholar who was writing about the need to decolonize psychology in developmental science. So things to consider is who's asking the questions, who has access to the resources, what language are we using, who are we studying and for who. Okay, part 2, field research. So with my colleagues, I published 3 perspective pieces, 2 of them listed here, and another one was with Michelle Klein. We have 3 perspective pieces with suggestions or considerations for current and future scientists as they engage in cross-cultural developmental science. So in the roadmap, we provide a series of questions that we encourage folks to ask themselves, and we have some recommendations. And in the Brush and Crittenden paper of 2021, we outline all that we can think of. We outline major issues in cross-cultural research because, like, as you could see, doing this one-off mere self-recognition task doesn't really get us very far. And there are problems with that. There are actually, well, methodological problems as well as ethical problems with doing these tasks and claiming, most of the population is not passing and we are the outliers. So there are so many problems with the methods, and we argue that folks should consider alternative methods when doing cross-cultural fieldwork in developmental science. Another paper, which I highly suggest reading, by Dorsa Amir and Katie McAuliffe, they compare and contrast 2 approaches: the breadth, which compares across cultures or across countries, and the depth approach, which looks closely in depth at one culture. Now, I would argue an interdisciplinary and multi-method approach would be the way to go, but I love the way that they broke this down into the pros and cons to each approach, right? So it's not necessarily that one is better than the other, but that they work complementary to each other. So I started doing field research as you know, in Kenya, but also in Fiji, St. Lucia, and other parts of the world. The red dots here, as you see, are places where I've been collecting data over the years. And these yellow dots are places where I've collaborated more recently, looking at natural observations of children in everyday contexts in different regions. So with my close colleagues, we've collected data and put it together to make one resource of natural observations of children in their everyday life, children and families in their everyday life. Okay, so when I started at Simon Fraser University in 2012, I started working on Tana Vanuatu. I'd been traveling to Tana for a number of years with my advisor, Philippe Rochat, bringing students there on a study abroad program. This picture is with my former co-mentor, Joe Henrik, because I was working with Joe in Fiji for a number of years. I felt like I was really just living there every summer and doing very little. I don't know what he would say, but I was contributing a bit to his research program, but mostly living and getting to know people and doing extremely slow science, which I think is the best way to go. And if I could have those years back, I'd do it all over again in a minute. So I had a knowledge base, at least for the South Pacific, for Fijian life and island society life. And so I chose Tana for a number of reasons, but one, because I had a bit of a knowledge base. I knew a bit about Tana Vanuatu. I wasn't Tanese. I hadn't lived there for any length of time, but I did have a bit of knowledge about the region. And, 1 second. It was remote. So there was Melanesian and Polynesian influence. So it's an island nation in the South Pacific. It's near Fiji and New Caledonia. It has influences, as I said, from both Melanesia and Polynesia. And communities have historically relied on subsistence style farming and marine foraging for a livelihood. So it's a small scale society. They live in these small hamlets of about 100 people per village. And it's remote. So why that was interesting to me is because it was far enough removed from Western influence. I was curious as to how, the rest of the world parented. Not how globalization has affected parenting. That's also an interesting question. But I was interested just in maybe a diversity, capturing the range of variation of human possibilities and family lifestyles. Lastly, I haven't made much progress with this, but I was really interested in informal learning. I've always been really interested in how children learn the things that they do without formalized teaching. How do we learn from each other? How do we learn from other caregivers and community members? And so why Vanuatu is such a great and interesting place, and specifically Tana, is because a small percentage of the population is called custom, and they refer to themselves as custom culture, and they reject formalized education, and many other things. So we could compare, and they're living right next door to people who are traditional Tanese or Ni Vanuatu society. So we can really kind of compare informal learning and formal learning in sort of a within culture experiment, and look at how children are learning and how parents are engaging and teaching in different ways. It's a large project, and I've just made baby steps so far, but still interesting, I think. Okay. So again, the methods, so our field research methods. So we use a variety of different methods. This is just a list of some methods that are used in anthropology, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. Ethnography, observations, focal follow, that's selecting an individual and following them around, and either recording targeted behaviors, or there's a number of different ways that you can do these. And this book is a great resource by Russ Bernard. Video recordings and storytelling. So I combine these anthropological methods with our rigorous methods from psychology using video recordings, so video observations using structured parent-infant interactions or natural observations. Now I know probably I always forget that people are probably saying, wait a second, how can they be natural observations if you have a video camera, in their face or whatever? But actually what we do is, and this takes time, this doesn't happen overnight, but we get friends and community members to do recordings. So, we have volunteers do recordings, and they become, in communities, you'd be surprised at how quickly you can forget that there's a video on recording you. So they do, in my opinion, and this is up for debate, but in my observation and also watching the videos, they do seem to match everyday life in these particular regions. We use interviews to the best of our ability, translating and back translating multiple languages, and experiments to a small degree, but we have still used experiments somewhat successfully and sometimes not. We more recently, I guess since I've been working in Vanuatu, I've been doing community engaged research. And I just want to add a note here. There's a lot of text on this slide, but if you could just bear with me for a minute, you could refer to Bud Hall's resource if you want to know more about it. But really, community engaged research, we could provide you with a toolkit, or, I've given entire lectures about community engaged research, but it's really changing the mindset and thinking of people as people and contributors who have questions and interesting perspectives, and who are scientists themselves, and have relevant knowledge and information to provide. I mean, people have been living and learning for centuries, and we haven't always recognized the extent of the knowledge that is captured in communities. So I think by taking a step back, shifting our lens and recognizing community members as contributing individuals will help to promote sort of a community engaged method or style. So changing the mindset from an extractive to a partnership methodology. So recognizing the different kinds of knowledge and knowledge holders. We're working on a paper where we document how one might do that in developmental science with my student Yitong Wang and colleagues. Different partnerships, identifying the different levels of partnership and different kinds. So community engaged doesn't mean that it has to stem from the community. It's engaged, it doesn't have to begin with the community, but as long as community has a say or is a stakeholder in the research, I would argue from the outset that all projects can have the communities involved from the outset. But if you're already well on your way, then you can do this later on. Okay, so identifying your level of engagement with the tools you have. So collaborations, academic, community stakeholders, and develop an asset model for your collective goals and determine what is feasible for you. So this is what I'm saying for you, but this is how we've done it with our research in the community. Okay, so methods, we're done with that and the motivation. So with the core similarities and cultural variability, what do we know about children's social and emotional development across cultures? What seems to be similar and cuts across cultural boundaries, and what is variable with culture context? So there are more questions here than there are answers to understanding what is essential, common, and necessary for healthy development. I'm going to talk to you about some impressions from the research on early child development to date. So some impressions that I've formed based on our work and observations, our informal observations of living and working in different societies, as well as the readings. Literature. Okay. So I guess we're doing okay on time. So infancy. So there are similarities in the ways that we communicate with infants. I think your speaker or what I don't recall who was introducing me. I didn't have yeah, anyway. So you guys had mentioned that I referred to a paper where I wrote about parents having a signature, a communicative signature with their infant. And I think that that holds across cultures. I think that we can actually marry the anthropological ethnographies that are claiming that, face-to-face interaction is rare, and our work being psychologists, that say that face-to-face interaction is essential and infant-directed speech is essential and responsiveness is essential. There is a common ground here, and I'm just going to kind of try to describe it to you. I think that what's happening is that parents and infants are engaging in a very private time in a lot of small-scale societies that maybe anthropologists don't necessarily witness, or maybe there are more female anthropologists in the field, I'm not sure, or more people studying children and infants. So there's a bit more work coming out on that, on parent-infant interactions. What we found, I'm just going to jump down to the bottom one here, with responsiveness, which is a basic tenet of attachment theory, that we need to have responsive parenting for secure attachment. We found that contingency and affective mirroring, so responding to your baby within a certain time, mirroring their emotions, those exist. Okay, so when you look very closely with structured observations, they are there, okay, across diverse societies. Of course, we didn't look in every corner of the world, but I would bet that all parents are engaging with their infants in similar ways with respect to responsiveness. However, that's the core level of responsiveness, but there's variability in how we communicate, right? And so we have a paper that you could look up. So the ways in which we respond to babies, the kinds of emotions that we encourage and discourage, there's variability there, okay? So the stuff that babies need, the essential stuff of responsiveness, sure, common across cultures, the variability, the interesting cultural variability is in how we respond and what we respond to. With our work, we found that there's more variability in contingency and affect mirroring within a culture than between cultures. Okay, so that suggests that it is quite common across diverse contexts. Okay, so just a quick note about infant-directed speech. I've done a few pieces looking at infant-directed speech. And the reason was I was really curious. Learning about infant-directed speech as being such an important thing in developmental psychology. And I thought, wow, I don't hear parents talking to their infants in these ways. And in fact, it's frowned upon to talk to babies and children. So we looked at the acoustic properties of infant-directed speech, and we found that sure enough, parents modify the pitch and range of their speech when talking to babies. Now, of course, there's still many questions about why we do this and what babies get from this, which we talk about in another paper where we look at the acoustic properties by Maclay and colleagues in 2021. But basically, people are talking to their babies. They're doing the same kinds of modifications that parents are in the US and Canada, for example, okay? But we didn't look at the amount. Okay, so this is just a structured observation where we compare parents talking to infants and parents or caregivers talking to another adult, and we find this speech modification. Now, others have found, like I mentioned before, rare in the amount of infant-directed speech. So that's a bit of a problem. So here, on one hand, I show that and others have shown that, okay, so there is some infant-directed speech, right? When parents are talking to their babies, they're modifying in interesting ways the way that has been shown in the literature and documented as being important, but there's not much of it. So what does that mean? All of these are fully functioning, societies. So how are children learning language if infant-directed speech is so important? How are they learning the communicative strategies needed to survive in that society? How are they communicating and learning? So with a paper by my student, Zara Halavani and colleagues, and Henny Young and myself, we looked at, we call it the missing piece. So when parents aren't producing infant-directed speech, what else are they doing that could contribute and support language development? So it turns out that they're using body language to communicate. So we're calling it infant-directed behavior. In fact, we don't look at, the acoustic properties or whatever, the modification, the exaggeration of the body, but we just look at body language that's directed toward the baby and language that's directed toward the baby. To encourage folks to look beyond something like infant-directed speech. So to have not a deficit model of other societies, right? So instead of just looking, oh, there's not much infant-directed speech, well, what else is there? That was our question. Okay, forget about what they're not doing. What are they doing? Okay, so that was the Halavani paper, and I'll jump down to variation in speech content. So this was some work with my former student, Senai Chebioglu, and our colleague Kelly Marin. And we looked at cultural variation in the kinds of things that we talk about with children. So we looked at parent speech this one was to toddlers. We look at, and I must say that this was a lot of work for Senai because translations. She not only had to translate from the local language, not dialect, local language, she had to translate, I think, 4 or 3 times, 4 times, yeah. And one of the languages, the local language, is not a written language. So it became quite tricky to do this. Anyhow, methodological aside. So what she found is that there's cultural variation in the kinds of things that we talk about. Parents in Canada focused attention on the child, and parents on TANA focused on outward movements and action. So this is in line with other findings in the literature. So parents in TANA Vanuatu We're not focusing on mental state talk, for example, and parents in Canada were. So, for example, a Canadian parent might be observed saying, "Hey, how are you? How are you feeling? What do you want to do today?" Focusing on the child, focusing on their state. Parents in Tana, on the other hand, might say, "Oh, do this, move that arm, let's go here." So, on action oriented and movement and outward focused ways of thinking. It turns out that these were linked with mirror self-recognition, but that's another paper. Last but not least, I think it's almost last, second last. All right. Mutual joy. So my favorite topic of all time lately. We just started writing about this despite 11 years of thinking about it. As an aside project with my colleague Jeremy Carpendale. So we just got to revise and resubmit for a paper in human development on mutual joy and social cognitive development. And I do have a chapter in the Handbook of Infant and Early Child Mental Health on this. And it's this idea that mutual joy is a concept that cuts across boundaries and family contexts. And we think that it cuts across all social cognitive development milestones, that it might be an important feature that is like a springboard for language learning, for social cognitive development. So it is this idea that there are these mutually joyful moments and they contribute to early development in critical ways, that it's the driving force behind infant communication, and also that it's critical to infant and child well-being. Okay. I would also argue that it lasts throughout the lifespan, that individuals need to be recognized in a positive manner from infancy through toddlerhood, through their adolescence and into adulthood, that there needs to be these moments of shared positive experiences okay, I'll just take a step back, but the mutual joy as the driving force behind communication, it's this idea that we have the goal to have mutual joy. It's a goal in and of itself. And to have that mutual joy, we must communicate and share perspectives. And so that it is the driving force behind that. And we also have done a bit of work. So basically, this idea of mutual joy, it comes out of our general observations, our experience in the field, observing children and families in context, but also we're finding evidence for it existing in the literature. It's not discussed, but it's there. So I think that's going to be another paper where we review the literature. And I allude to it a little bit in the mutual joy and social development chapter. So we've looked at fathers, mutual joy and attachment, and this is because we were doing an attachment project, questioning the tenets of attachment theory. So as you know, attachment theory is one of the foundational theories in developmental psychology, and also I guess I would say questioned by those of us who do work across cultures. The tenets are that you have to have a strong bond with one individual early in life, and that you're cared for by, one individual, and that individual must respond and, in a timely and appropriate manner. Okay, so Heidi Keller wrote this great paper questioning the tenets of attachment theory. And if you haven't read it, I encourage you to dig it up. It's fantastic. I don't recall the year, 2013, I believe. So a strong bond with one individual early in life. Well, that's a problem for our observations across cultures where infants and children are cared for by other siblings and other adults, and they're not necessarily spending time with one individual. Okay, so this is a question. Societies where there are multiple caregivers and children are from very early on are cared for and passed around to many other caregivers and adults. And then the question of responsiveness, which I already discussed earlier. So I was curious about this. One thing that I was really wondering about is I dug up the resources for Dr. Keller's review on attachment. And it was fantastic ethnography and descriptive work. But there was really from my recollection, and I'll just kind of briefly mention this, but there wasn't any evidence in the sense of like recorded observations. Like we didn't there was no quantitative evidence, and I know qualitative, as I'm saying throughout this whole thing, is evidence, but I was just curious, who are kids actually spending their time with? Do we have any record of it? And so I dug into my collaborative resource. So we had our natural observation data set, and we coded over 900 videos of children in their daily life across 5 different societies. And as a first pass, we just looked at who kids are spending their time with, who's present. So we looked at the natural observations of children's social behavior in these 5 societies. And it turns out that they're spending most of their time with one primary caregiver, who happens to be the female. We have since coded this data in the first 2 years of life. So it looks as though even though children are cared for by multiple individuals, one individual seems to be present consistently. And I'm not saying that's necessary. That's just what the data told us. So that tells me that that attachment theory can persist. At least it exists, or it can work in these societies that I've documented here. So I don't know if it speaks to the theory in general, but at least in our observations here with our natural observation data set, it looks as though it isn't a problem. Okay, and we did, just a couple minutes left. We did, sorry to say, we did the strange situation scenario in Vanuatu and in Canada. We did it as sort of it was a much bigger study, and it was fantastic in the way that we had lots of interviews and lots of community input and parent information, and we had interviews with teachers about children, and we had experiments. But what we report in this one paper is the first thing that we looked at was children's attachment style. So to be honest, I didn't think that the strange situation would work. I thought it's a very weird design. I know that it worked, with Mary Ainsworth in Uganda, but that was done very well, and it was done a bit differently. And so the way that the strange situation has evolved, I wasn't sure that it would work. But I got some great recommendations from some colleagues, and what we did was we created a situation where children were engaged with their father. The father left. There's no stranger. The father just leaves, and then the father comes back. And we just look at, we have, attachment experts code it and determine the categories removed from context. So they're not part of the research project. What was really interesting, so we found the same, I should have a figure up here for you, but I don't, but we found the same kinds of attachment categories with some caveats. But what was really interesting is secure attachment was linked to mother's report of father's play with child. So despite so many other variables that we had in our model, the only thing that continuously comes out significant is whether the mother thinks or reports that the father plays with the child, how much he plays with the child. That was predictive of the child's attachment to the father. So I thought that was really kind of interesting, especially in light of the mutual joy. So we moved on from that paper. Oops, I'll just tell you one more thing. We moved on from that, and we have since coded mutual joy in those dyads and have found the same thing. Again, it could just be capturing the essence of that play with the child, but we looked at the structured observations, and we find that mutual joy, so these shared positive moments with the child, is actually predictive of their secure attachment with the father. So again, all of these are really kind of shocking and surprising to me, and most often I never really think that they're going to work, but they seem to. Okay. And just a note that some things that we're working on now, social learning. I've always been curious about how children learn from others, and how they learn about nature and the environment in an informal context. So I've been working on that with Indigenous communities, both in Vanuatu as well as here in rural Nova Scotia, First Nations communities here in Nova Scotia, to look at how children learn about nature and environment beyond formalized educational settings. And just to conclude, understanding human psychology requires an understanding of the role of experience, which we need to examine the majority culture. Okay, so that's the non-weird culture. We need to look at different corners of the world, or at least get outside of the laboratory to examine how people are living in everyday life. And we should calibrate one's confidence in claiming generalizability, and state those assumptions that we're making. There need to be institutional changes and support for new scientists doing slow science, and for qualitative research, as well as to recognize that there are different sources of knowledge and different methods that can contribute to a better view and more accurate knowledge of child development. And the only way that we're going to do this is through collaborations and partnerships. So none of the work that I had mentioned here today would have been possible on my own. Maybe some lab work, maybe some really focused, narrow lab work, but beyond that, we need collaborations and partnerships across disciplines in order to do all of this, or to make some good progress. Okay, and that's it for today. Just the resources for you again. I'll just put those up there, and I can put that slide up again if people are curious. And thank you to my team. Some pictures of Vanuatu and some of the past and current graduate students. Thank you for attending.
Thank you.